Hello, everyone, and welcome to lecture number 2 for chapter 19, China Limits European Contacts. And as you guys are going to surmise, or already can surmise, we're going to talk about how China is going to limit European contact in this age of exploration and start to isolate themselves. But before we get into that, we're going to actually have to talk about how China in itself actually started to expand and explore and come into contact, maybe not directly with Europeans at first, but more in contact with other people in the Indian Ocean trade basin. So this is going to be something that's very important that leads to the title of this lecture, China Limiting European Contact. So let's begin. So to start this story, we have to start with the establishment of the Ming Dynasty. And when the Ming Dynasty comes to power, they're going to turn China into a dominant force. And if it was a global world like it is today, China would have been the dominant power in the world. But it's not a global world at the time. It's more a regional one, and they're the dominant power in Asia. They have many established vassal states and tributary states that they have control over or get gifts and tribute from. Most notably in Southeast Asia, in places like what we would call today Vietnam and Laos, and Cambodia. And then obviously in Korea, which they had a lot of control over in various forms for centuries. Now, the Ming Dynasty starts in 1368 when their Emperor Hongwu is able to push the vestiges of the Mongol leadership out of China. And when he's able to do that, he makes sure that he gets his people fed and restores agricultural practices in China. And he does this for three main reasons. One, people are happier when they're well fed and they have food, and they're going to follow his leadership or be more likely to follow the leadership of the government. We see that with any group of people. Two, China has many times throughout history they've had problems with environmental disasters causing problems with their access to food, such as flooding, damaging fields, or causing famines that arise. And he wants to make sure that those don't happen or they have stuff build up so that his first objective can be met. And then three, it's so that they can actually use those crops to promote them for commercial trade and expand the wealth outwards for China. And then the last thing that he does is he starts to try to erase Mongolian influences in the Chinese society. And we'll see one way that he does this here next. Now, what I was talking about is one way he tried to erase Mongolian influences is he encouraged a return to Confucian standards and values that were being practiced at the time of Mongolian rule, but were really much more established and at the forefront in the previous dynasties of Chinese history. And he pushes for those standards to be brought back and be brought to the forefront of society. He also returns the government to what we call a merit-based system using the old civil service exam established in China. And now this is important because that means that people are going to get promoted based on their skill, not their position in society. Now, he was a very good ruler. However, late in his reign, for various reasons that we don't have time to get into in this course, he becomes a tyrant and starts to rule China with more of an iron fist. Now, when he dies, his son Yongle takes power. And Yongle is going to be very important because he wants to show off the Chinese dominance in the world. He wants to show it off to people. And so he strives to show the outside world what Chinese power is and what it's like. And he does this by commissioning what are going to be 7 voyages that are going to go throughout Asia, India, the entire Indian Ocean area, all the way to the Middle East and East Africa. And he also moves the court to Beijing, which is the capital city of China today. It still exists there, or resides there. Now, the person that he picks to lead these voyages is Zheng He, and he's perhaps the greatest explorer that most people have never heard of. He actually might be the greatest explorer of all time, given the fact of his, just the sheer scope, size, and number of voyages that he leads during this period. Now, these expeditions, they range from just going to local areas in Southeast Asia, or fairly local for Chinese standards, to Southeast Asia, like the Straits of Malacca, all the way to the Middle East and East Africa. So he's really kind of covering all the way from East Africa to China and Japan. That's a huge, huge scope of the globe. And these fleets are massive, and they have these giant treasure ships. As you guys can see in the picture below, that's a to-scale rendering of what one of the Chinese treasure ships under Zheng He would be if it was next to just one of the ships that Columbus used to sail across the Atlantic Ocean in 1492. You can see they're much, much bigger. And they're carrying all these pieces of wealth and power and goods that China has to give these gifts to distribute to people in the places like the Straits of Malacca or India or East Africa. And by doing this, the Chinese are able to not only show off their influence, but they're also able to get goods and resources from other places in the globe, as well as dignitaries to come back with them and kind of have a more mixture of cultures and society that we haven't really seen in a grand scale previous in history, or for a long time, since the fall of the Han Dynasty in ancient Rome. So this is a huge, huge mixing of cultures and show-off of power and goods from many places in the world, with obviously China being the ones that are the preeminent power here in showing their dominance and their wealth. Now, as you guys can see here, what I was talking about, these are the voyages of Zheng He, starting in China here and then making their way all the way to far-off places in Arabia and East Africa, as well as mostly focusing on the Indian Ocean and East Asian basin, because these are people that they've had some contacts with, and they're also really, really rich as well. So this is a map of all of his voyages. Now, what happens after Yongle dies is China, the leadership starts to change. And Yongle, I believe, dies after the 6th voyage that Zheng He takes, and then Zheng He completes the 7th after his death. And then things change. China starts to actually isolate themselves, so much that a lot of their leaders start to try to purge history of Zheng He's exploits, which is one of the reasons why we haven't really focused on what he did a lot in history classes until recently. But anyways, from a foreign relations standpoint, this is where China starts to get into isolating itself from the outside world, in particular Europeans. They direct that the government in China directs that foreign trade can only be used by, or only be done by the government, which turns trade into more of a black market system. And trade still does remain profitable for many people because of smugglers. This is actually one of the reasons why the black market, the center of the black market, still to this day exists in China, is because of this starting of closed door relations here at this time. But China doesn't start to industrialize as the world starts to industrialize. Now, when I mean industrialize, yes, I mean by like modern technology standpoint of like the Industrial Revolution, but in other ways previously as well, as in the years and decades leading up to what we would consider the Industrial Revolution. They don't do that because they think it offends the Confucian beliefs and standards that they've pushed for centuries in China. And then also they're an agricultural group. They're an agricultural society. Many of their people are based in agriculture, so they favor it. Now, Christian missionaries are still coming into China, mainly through Silk Road routes and so forth, and they're bringing European culture. So there is a little bit of contact, at least in the beginning stages of these closed door period. Now, what happens though is the Ming Dynasty is actually going to fall, and they're going to fall when a group called the Manchus invade China. and take over, and they're going to name themselves the Qing Dynasty. Now, the Qings aren't Chinese, and this is going to lead to several rebellions that are going to take place. This is something that was very similar that happened when the Mongols took over earlier. Now, there are some things that the Qing actually do that keeps China in their grasp and they're able to control. One, they follow Confucian beliefs. Many people follow that. It's the same thing if you keep, like the Muslims, when they allowed people to practice their religions peacefully. Same deal here, even though Confucianism isn't necessarily, you wouldn't consider it a religion. They also keep the same social structure, so life doesn't necessarily change for most. But that still does lead to some rebellions because they're not directly Chinese. But as time goes on, they restore prosperity because prosperity had started to fall off with the closed door policies of the Ming. And they defend certain borders and expand other borders, which brings people to follow their lead even more, the regular Chinese citizens. Now, some important rulers during this period for the Qing are Kanji. He lowers taxes. He opens the doors to China just a little bit, welcoming Jesuit missionaries, which means that there's more advancements in contact with the outside world, in this case Europeans. In Qianlong, he is able to rule China at its greatest size and power and extent, really in history, because at this time they've expanded into places that we consider parts of Russia, Afghanistan, most of Southeast Asia, Mongolia, and so forth. They're pretty big at this time under the Qing in Qianlong. Now, to further talk about isolation, we need to get into what's going to transpire later on. And China becomes a cultural center of the universe. And really, they always have been. If you look at their advancements, you look at their size, it's just now we're opening up into more of a globalized world. So, but the Chinese, to make a long story short, not to get too complicated and too detailed, they're still practicing a lot of closed door policies and isolation. And foreigners can only trade at special ports. They have to pay certain tributes if they're from different areas outside of the Dutch. The Dutch are the only really truly accepted trade partners to the Chinese. That's because the Chinese know that they just want trade. They're not a big country. They're not going to be able to subjugate them and control them enough. So they're not necessarily scared of them in that way. That's one of the reasons why they're able to be accepted trade partners. Now, they do trade with Britain, but as Britain grows through the imperial and colonial period, they start to face problems over that idea of not only respect between different cultures and leadership, but also the tribute payments. And what this leads to is because of the problem that the Chinese had where they didn't industrialize, which is going to set them back. And you combine that with the fact that the Europeans opened their doors to do so, and their expansion in other parts of the globe have led to immense amounts of wealth, and the scientific revolution and so forth has hit them. They've taken off in the Industrial Revolution, and the Chinese haven't. And this leads to the Europeans slowly, and I mean all groups of Europeans. And as you can see here in this famous political cartoon around the Boxer Rebellion, you have the British, you have the Germans, you have the Russians, you have the French, and even the Japanese by that period are going to get into the fold and start to chip away at the restrictions that are put on them by China and establish really de facto control of not only the Chinese government, but their trading network through what they're going to be known as spheres of influence. But that's for another time and another lesson. But it does show that the Chinese are really starting to take a back seat to Europeans, and one of the reasons why they wanted to isolate themselves from them. Now, to move to a different group, we talked about Korea at the very beginning of this lecture. They were one of the vassal states of China, and for many parts of their periods, they've been a vassal state or under control by either Chinese or Japanese because of not only where they're located, but because of their size as well. And in 1636, the Manchus are able to conquer Korea. They establish as a vassal state. Their government is organized around Confucian principles because of their closeness to China. A lot of diffusion has come from China to Korea because of this proximity. So they're organized along the same lines as Chinese society. They have a lot of same technology, culture is very similar, and isolation is something that they're going to practice as well. Now, for them, isolation is going to be fairly easy because of geography, both from mountains to the north and because they're a peninsula. But just like when you have in other parts in history and other times in history, when you have a small group of people being subjugated either peacefully or not peacefully by another group, nationalistic ideas in Korea are going to take shape. And like we've talked about previous, of course, where they've taken shape before, they're going to start to want sovereignty. And they're going to push back in several instances throughout history to try to gain their independence and try to gain their sovereignty for themselves because they don't want to be subjugated. And we still see this to this day in terms of the reflections of this kind of idea of them becoming a vassal state. Although it's in a completely different form, we still see this today in how Korea split up in North and South and how that has actually taken itself into a completely new realm. But again, that is for another course and for another time. All right, last slide here, and we'll wrap it up. So life in China during this period of time, specifically in the 16 and 1700s, before we get into European exploration and expansion taking off in the Industrial Revolution, it's peace and prosperity. They're doing very well. They've got all the resources they need. Irrigation techniques are going well. Environmental catastrophes aren't causing problems with flooding as much as they have in the past. They've developed new types of fertilizer, which leads to they have more food, they have more crops, they have an expansion of trade with Europe because of this, and you have various forms of back and forth between when they're open to Europe and not, and you see an explosion in population. Now, one of the reasons why this explosion in population takes place is not just because of those advancements in better conditions with irrigation and fertilization in the environment, but it's because of what we call the Columbian Exchange, because of Columbus's voyages and the world becoming more connected. You have crops such as corn and potatoes getting to China for the first time and allowing for people to have higher caloric diets, which means that they're healthier, they can have more kids, and you have a population explosion. Now, to switch gears here in their society, females are not valued as much in Chinese society at this time as much as males. Males are favored. Oftentimes female infants are killed because of this. Their population issues. And again, China is still practicing several population restrictions as we see to the one-child policy. But again, for another course, maybe even another topic. But you see a male-dominated society. Now, the other thing that we've talked about, even though there's been a lot of advancements for China, they've been brought back and held back, in some ways good, in some ways bad, by the two dynasties that rule them during this period, the Ming and Qing, because they follow the older traditions, and although that helps with the Chinese nationalism, it's going to hurt them in the years to come, as we talked about previously, where the Europeans as well as the Japanese start to chip away at their restrictions and then start to take control of China in using the spheres of influence. And with that, guys, that's all. I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and I'll see you guys for section 3. Have a good day.